Hi everyone, welcome back to another fun-filled lesson of M.O Actual Speaking. My name is Jennifer Clyde. It is time for lesson 34, and for those of you that tuned in lesson 33, you know what we're going to talk about today. We'll talk about news, the news. So, do you keep up to date with the news? Do you know what's happening around the world as well? As for me, I don't really read the paper, meaning the newspaper, but I usually hear things from my friends. Or just by chance, if I'm flipping through the channels at home, I might watch the news maybe once every, 2 or 3 days. I know I should be keeping up with the news. Okay, so today we'll be talking about news and the different sources. Now, what news source do you use? Do you check the news with your smartphone? Okay, you may have an application. Or do you check the news online, on television, or do you actually read newspapers? We'll be talking about that. Okay, then are you ready? Let's get started. You know, a quick thought that I wanted to share with you, or maybe a question. Do you read through all the pages in a newspaper, whether it's online or an actual newspaper? I'm sure almost no one does that. Too many pages and too many sections, right? So are you the type that skims through the newspaper, maybe checks out maybe this and that, just the corners or sections you are interested in? You may read the headlines and go straight to the crossword puzzle or the horoscope. Or do you read everything in detail to keep up with the news? All right, think about that as we begin our warm-up segment with the 5 W's and H questions. Okay, here we go with, as usual, who or the what type of news follower are you? Now, we talked about, of course, many SNS sites. You may be a follower on a certain site, but news follower basically means a person that tries to keep up to date with the news. You know what's happening on a daily basis. So, what type of news follower are you? In other words, are you into hard or soft news? Yeah, hard here means, serious news. And soft news would possibly be something about maybe leisure and activities, traveling, light news, I guess. So, are you more into hard news, serious news, or lighter news, softer news? Think about that. And then let's move on to what. Okay, what type of news are you mostly interested in? Okay, so what kinds of news, what types of news really interests you? What type of news are you interested in? Let's move on to another what question. What news outlets or sources do you frequent? So frequent could mean to go often, right? To check out often. So perhaps it could be a section in a newspaper. But news outlets, okay, or news sources. These are all different things you can check out for the news, okay? So think about that question as well. Our next what question is, what or which smartphone applications do you use to check current events or issues? Current means present, the latest. So latest or current events or current issues. So what do you do? Okay, which smartphone apps or applications do you use to check out current events or current issues? Okay, now what or which sections or pages of the paper do you read first? Now let's first check out sections. Okay, there are many sections in a newspaper, and there are many pages in the paper as well. And here I said paper, okay? It's actually the paper, which is another way of calling the newspaper, okay? For example, I could ask you, did you read today's newspaper? I could also ask you, did you read today's paper? Which means newspaper, okay? 신문을 뜻하는 게 the paper예요. So, do you read first? So, which sections of the newspaper do you read first? Do you check out first? Now, when? When do you watch the news on television? I think these days a lot of people are on the move and you're very busy. You may not have enough time to sit down at home to enjoy the news on television. So you might have different ways of checking the news. So ask yourself, when do you watch the news on TV, on television? And also, when was the last time you read the news in print newspaper? So print newspaper would actually be the traditional newspaper. Paper newspaper is also called print newspaper. We're not talking about online newspapers. We're talking about actual newspapers, and it's called print newspaper, okay? Keep that in mind. Another one, when did you start reading the news online? Because many years ago, a lot of people or a lot of households, now they all read print newspapers. We would have newspapers delivered to our homes early in the morning, even till this day, but I think not that many people actually read print newspapers. So ask yourself, when did you start reading the news online? Not print newspapers, but when did you start reading news online or the news? Now, where do you usually read the news? I know that if you are a student or if you perhaps commute to work, you may have a 30-minute, 40-minute, a 1-hour commute, and you have plenty of time on your hands. In that case, you could perhaps read the news on the subway, on the bus, wherever it is, or perhaps when you go to school, maybe not, but when you go to work, you may have some time. So where do you usually read the news? Think about that question. Now over to our why. Why do you prefer reading print newspaper, okay, to reading the news online? So print newspapers. Do you enjoy reading newspapers in print, or do you like to read them online? But if you are the type that likes to read print newspapers, think about why you prefer print newspapers to news online. Okay, and why do you prefer something, which means your choice of news source? As I briefly did mention, you may have an application or you may have downloaded an app onto your smartphone, and that could be a news source. You could check news online. So if you check the news online, the internet could be a news source as well. So think about why you prefer that specific news source. Okay, moving on to another why. Why don't you? Okay, why don't you try to keep up to date with current events? Some people like to read the newspaper all the time to keep up with the current events, meaning one more time, what's happening at the present. What's happening currently. But if you don't like to read the paper, if you don't like to check out the news online or with any other news source, ask yourself why you don't try to keep up to date with the current news. Okay, let's move on to our final category, how. We've got two for you. How do you generally keep up with the news in and around the world? So to keep up with means what? To follow, in other words, okay? So how do you generally keep up with or follow the news in and around the world? In and around the world, it's used in many different situations, but in and around the world, okay? Use it as one expression, which means domestically in Korea and around the world, internationally, right? So how do you keep up with or follow the news, meaning how do you keep up with what happens in Korea and abroad? Here's our final how question. How much time do you spend watching or reading the news on average? So think about how much time you spend on average checking out the news, checking out what's happening in and around the world. And that about wraps it up for our brainstorming cues for today. Those were our 5 W's and how questions.
So Rachel, how do you keep up with the news in Korea?
Yeah, I like to look at my smartphone. I downloaded a ton of apps to keep up with the news. So I do go through my applications and filter the news and things like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you do that on Twitter or?
No, they actually have applications from like AP or Reuters, which is what I really enjoy. I feel like they're more neutral, I guess, than some of the other wires or media news sources. But I feel like it's really important to keep up with current events.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you like to keep up with current events, or how do you keep up with the daily news?
Well, I think the term breaking news has become almost an oxymoron these days.
Yeah.
Because so much of the news is reiterated it and reiterated, like 24-hour news stations didn't exist a
Right.
long time ago.
That's
So
true.
it was valuable to watch the news.
Okay.
But nowadays, I try to filter out as much as possible. So I just wait for people to tell me what's going on.
Oh, right.
If something's important enough, I'll hear about it.
Yeah, that's true. But I do also like to read like newspapers for other reasons.
What's the first section you look at in the newspaper?
Okay, the first section is international news. It's really important to me because I want to know what's going on throughout the world, and it's also very applicable to my studies right now.
Of course, yeah.
But I also love the style section. I love reading about weddings and wedding announcements.
Okay.
Yeah, it gives me inspiration and also kind of hope too, because the news can be very dark and drab at times. So when I read stuff like that, it's like, oh, love does exist, hope does exist in things. So,
Well, I'm a very positive person, so the news kind of brings me down.
yeah, that's
So
true.
actually, when I pick up a newspaper, the first thing I look at is the comics.
Those are the best. I love the comic section too.
To bring yourself up before you bring yourself down with the front page.
That is true. Yes, but I think it is important to keep up with current events and be updated about it.
Let's find out what's happening now.
Let's go.
Did you enjoy today's actual talk? Well, of course, Rachel and Peter were talking about the news in general and how they keep up with current events or current issues, the news in and around the world. Now, what did Rachel say? She said that she's downloaded many, tons of applications onto her smartphone, and that is how she checks the news. She's especially interested in international news and also the style section in the newspaper. Now, Peter said that he's not really into reading the news. He does pick up the newspaper once in a while, but he goes straight to the comic section, right? Because he is more of a positive person, and many of the news articles kind of depresses you and brings you down. So that is briefly what the two talked about. Let's take a look at the actual talk line by line then. Okay, now Peter began by asking Rachel, how do you keep up with the news in Korea? So the question is, how? Let's focus on how she does it, okay? How do you keep up with something? How do you follow something? How do you keep up to date, okay, with something? And Rachel says, I like to look at my smartphone. Simple. So she uses her smartphone to keep up with the news in Korea. And then she adds some details. She said she downloaded a ton of apps. Now, a ton. Remember, we did go over this expression. A ton of something means many of something. So she has downloaded a ton of apps. Many apps, meaning applications, in order to keep up with the news. So she says, so I go through my applications and filter the news. Okay, let's take a look at these two expressions here. Now, she, of course, number one, uses her smartphone. She's downloaded many applications, and she uses those apps to keep up with the news. And she also said, I go through. It means read through in this case. She's reading the news, right? She goes through them and filters the news. I filter the news. So what is a filter? Let's say, for example, a coffee filter. What does a coffee filter do? You have ground coffee beans, you put it in the filter, and you pour hot water into it, right? And it filters it. So basically, you're not really brewing something to make it strong, okay? But actually, when you say you filter something, you're briefly going over it. You may read through it very quickly and perhaps forget about all the other unimportant things. Just catch the important things. You filter through something, go through something quite quickly. So I go through my applications, she reads through her applications and filters the news. Takes a quick look at it, she skims through it. And she says they actually have applications from so-and-so, from AP or Reuters, which are what I really enjoy. So she's talking about some of the apps that she really enjoys. And she says, I feel like they're more neutral. They're, meaning they are, of course, applications from AP or Reuters, right? So she's talking about these applications. They are more neutral. What is neutral? Often when we drive, we have neutral in our gear shift, right? So neutral basically means not to take any sides. You're just about in the middle, okay? You're not taking sides, you're not taking part, okay? So it's neutral compared to or than some of the other wires or media news sources. So wires here also mean, you know how we say with the internet we are wired, the world is wired, it means connected. So wires here, basically she's talking about news sources or media news sources. So simply put, she's comparing these applications are more neutral compared to many other wires or media news sources. And then she says, do you like to keep up with current events? She's asking Peter. How do you keep up with the daily news? So here are two questions. Do you like to keep up with the news? And also, how do you keep up with the daily news? Okay, let's see what Peter said. He says, I think the term breaking news has become almost an oxymoron these days. So let's first of all take a look at breaking news. Breaking news, what does that mean? Breaking news is more like a special report, right? Often we're watching a television program or even the news, and then on the bottom of the screen, it may say breaking news, or the screen may actually change, say breaking news. It means special report. If something important comes up, right, they broadcast it. So special report or breaking news. But he says, I think that term has become an oxymoron. An oxymoron is like a combination of words. And these words are contradictory, meaning they often mean very different things, but they're used together. So some of the oxymorons that are quite, I guess, common is this: pretty ugly, pretty ugly. She's pretty ugly, or it's pretty ugly. What does it mean? Does it mean it's pretty or ugly? These words are contradictory, but it means that it's ugly, although the word pretty is used. So that is exactly what it means. I think the term breaking news has become like an oxymoron these days because, he's explaining, because so much of the news is reiterated and reiterated. He's stressing it by saying twice, but re means again, right? Okay, it means again, and reiterated basically means to do something over and over again, or to say something over and over again. It means to repeat, okay? So he's saying so much of it, meaning so much of the breaking news these days, they're repeated and repeated, reiterated and reiterated. So 24-hour news stations did not exist a long time ago. Didn't exist a long time ago. So a long time ago, when there weren't any 24-hour news stations, breaking news, it really was surprising. Boom, it was breaking news. But nowadays, since you see or hear about these news everywhere, over and over again, it doesn't really feel like important news or breaking news. Okay, and of course, Rachel agrees, right? And then Peter says it was, or it used to be, valuable to watch the news. But nowadays, I try to filter out as much as possible. So filter out, once again, it means that you are not reading something or remembering something in detail, but you're filtering it out, okay? Just remembering part of it, reading through something very quickly, or just listening to something very quickly as well. I just wait for people to tell me what's going on. So he relies on people, and they tell him what's going on. And then he asks, what's the first section you look at in the newspaper? It's not on the newspaper, it's in the newspaper, okay? So he's asking about which section of the newspaper she reads first. Rachel says international news. I want to know what's going on throughout the world, okay? So that is why she reads the international news section, and she says it's also very applicable to my studies right now, okay? Applicable to my studies, meaning it is appropriate, okay? It fits her studies, it is helpful or applicable to her studies. And she says, I also love the style section. I love reading about weddings and wedding announcements, and she gives us a reason, okay? She says, it gives me inspiration and also hope. These are two positive words. The news can be heavy at many times, but she likes to read the style section because, yeah, that section gives her hope. It makes her happy, okay? And she says because the news can be very dark and drab at times. One more time, dark. What's dark? I know it's depressing, very serious, and drab also means serious as well. So she's saying dark and drab. Dark and drab, meaning it's so serious and depressing. So it's nice to check out the style section because it gives you hope. It makes you feel good sometimes. All right, now Peter says, well, I'm a very positive person. I'm a very optimistic person. So the news kind of brings me down. We went over this a long time ago. Bring someone down means to depress someone. So he's saying the news, yeah, kind of depresses me. It brings me down. So when I pick up a newspaper, the first thing I look at is the comic section. That is what he said. You can also say the first thing I do is look at the comics. So these are two different things. We have the comic section, that's right, the section in the newspaper, and also the comics. So you can use both things, okay? Okay, say it both ways. Okay, how or why? To bring yourself up, okay? Now we had bring me down means to depress, but I like to look at the comic section because it brings me up, meaning it makes me happy, okay? Now before you bring yourself down with the front page is, of course, as we see, the very front page of the newspaper. Now, Rachel does say, yes, but I think it is important to keep up with current events and be up to date with them, okay? So keep up with, be up to date with something basically means to know what's happening lately. So they just basically talked about which section of the newspaper they like to read first, which sections of the newspaper they are interested in, and how they check out the news. That is all for today's Actual Talk. Take a listen to it one more time, and at the same time, check out the subtitles.
So Rachel, how do you keep up with the news in Korea?
Yeah, you know, I like to look at my smartphone. I downloaded a ton of apps to keep up with the news. So I do go through my applications and filter the news and things like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you do that on Twitter or?
No, they actually have applications from like AP or Reuters, which is what I really enjoy. I feel like they're more neutral, I guess, than some of the other wires or media news sources. But, you know, I feel like it's really important to keep up with current events.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you like to keep up with current events, or how do you keep up with the daily news?
Well, I think the term breaking news has become almost an oxymoron these days.
Yeah.
Because so much of the news is reiterated and reiterated, like 24-hour news stations didn't exist a
Right.
long time ago.
That's
So
true.
it was valuable to watch the news.
Okay.
But nowadays, I try to filter out as much as possible. So I just wait for people to tell me what's going on.
Oh, right.
If something's important enough, I'll hear about it.
Yeah, that's true. But I do also like to read like newspapers for other reasons.
What's the first section you look at in the newspaper?
Okay, the first section is international news. It's really important to me because I want to know what's going on throughout the world, and it's also very applicable to my studies right now.
Of course, yeah.
But I also love the style section. I love reading about weddings and wedding announcements.
Okay.
Yeah, it gives me inspiration and also kind of hope too, you know, because the news can be very dark and drab at times. So when I read stuff like that, it's like, oh, you know, love does exist, hope does exist in things. So,
Well, I'm a very positive person, so the news kind of brings me down.
yeah, that's
So,
true.
actually, when I pick up a newspaper, the first thing I look at is the comics.
Those are the best. I love the comic section too.
To bring yourself up before you bring yourself down with the front page.
That is true. Yes, but I think it is important to keep up with current events and be updated about it.
Let's find out what's happening now.
Let's go.
Are you ready for some useful expressions when it comes to the news? Let's practice using these key expressions and words and, of course, phrases. Let's first of all begin with ways to talk about the kinds of news you keep up with, okay? So if you keep up with something, especially the news or a specific type of news. It means that you always follow it, okay? You're up to date. You always check it out. For example, you can say, I try to keep abreast of. We've taken a look at keep up with something. Another great expression you can use is keep abreast of, which means to follow, okay? Stay up to date, okay? So I try to keep abreast of domestic politics and business, okay? You could fill this part in yourself. So add what you are interested in. Remember, I try to keep abreast of. I try to keep abreast of so-and-so news. Got it? Another one is, my work requires me to stay up to speed, okay? To stay up to speed on current events. So stay up to speed basically means to be fully informed, okay? Up to speed, 100%, completely informed. You know everything about it. So if your work or your job requires you to stay up to speed on something, you can say, my work or job requires me to stay up to speed on so-and-so. In this case, you can say current events, which means what's happening at present, what's currently happening. So up to speed once again means to be fully informed, know everything about something. Another one, I'm a news junkie. Remember, junkie, it can be spelled with a J-U-N-K-Y or I-E. A junkie means what? Of course, it means to be addicted to something because you like it so much. So if you say I'm a news junkie, it means that you always check the news. You're addicted to the news. So I need to keep current on the news 24/7. Okay. Around the clock. 24/7, it means 24, short for 24 hours, and 7 is of course short for 7 days a week. So 24 hours, 7 days a week, meaning all the time, right? So I'm a news junkie. I love the news. I'm addicted to the news, so I have to keep current, means keep up with on the news all the time, 24/7. 24/7. Okay, let's move on. Now let's talk about some news outlets or news sources, things you can use to check out the news. You can say, I rely on different apps for up to the minute. Up to the minute means detailed. Traffic conditions, which is what I do, weather forecasts, or even stock prices. Yeah. I know a lot of my friends do this. So they have different applications on their smartphone and they have downloaded apps for up-to-the-minute traffic conditions. Up to the minute, the latest, okay? Weather forecasts and stock prices. If you're into stocks, yeah, you can download some apps and stay up to the minute, or you can have these apps for up-to-the-minute stock prices, information on stock prices. I'm always on the go. Do you remember this expression? On the move, on the go. It means you're moving around, right? I'm always on the go. I'm always moving around. I'm always going from one place to another. So I keep myself up to date through my BBC News app. This is just an example. So if you have a certain app, fill it in, okay? Fill it in and say, I'm always on the go. I'm always moving around, so I keep myself up to date with something or through blank blank application or app. Okay, let's move on. I try to stay informed every day via something. Now, via means through, right? Through. 무엇을 통해서. In this case, you can pronounce it two ways. Via or via. Okay, so I try to stay informed every day through so-and-so or via so-and-so. Keep these expressions in mind when it comes to news sources. Let's move on to ways to talk about your favorite newspaper sections, okay? A newspaper has different sections and pages, right? Things you can check out. Simply put, different topics. You can say, I'm obsessed with. You're really into it. I'm obsessed with the daily horoscope. I check my horoscope too. Not on a daily basis, but I do check it out. So if this is what you really or always check out, you can say, I'm obsessed with the so-and-so or so-and-so section as well. I can say, the daily horoscope section. Moving on. I normally start by reading. If this section is what you first read, you can say, I normally start by reading the blank or the blank section, the headlines, okay, just to see what's happening, what's in the paper. I mostly stay current. Means what? Stay up to date, keep up with, by reading through the local and foreign news section. So this is, once again, just a name of a section. You could fill it in yourself. Just remember, I mostly stay current by reading through the blank section or the blank page. Just keep these patterns in mind and, of course, add which sections you enjoy reading first or which section you're obsessed with. Okay, moving on to our last segment or last category, let's take a quick look at some news terms. Some things you may talk about, read about, or hear when it comes to staying up to date with the news. Now, a news ticker, it's also called a crawler or a slide. Okay, basically is shown in the lower screen, lower screen space of the television or monitor, especially when you're watching the news on television. And it presents the headline or minor pieces of the news. So that is a news ticker. It may move from one side to another, okay? It may say breaking news, and that's a ticker. Quickly, television stations use the ticker for weather warnings. Remember? For example, if it snows a lot, they'll say weather warning, or school closings and election results. So if you by any chance want to talk about what slid on the bottom screen of the television, perhaps giving you some information about some breaking news or special reports, keep in mind they are called tickers. Okay, that is all for today's expressions. Practice them on your own and make them yours by going over and over and over them. Okay, let's move on to our next segment. As always, it is time for an idiom. Today we are talking about the news. So let's check out an idiom that is related to the news. Here it is. It is break the news to someone. We talked about breaking news. What does breaking news mean? It means a special report, very important piece of news. Usually it's quite surprising. Usually breaking news is good or bad. I would say usually bad news. So break the news to someone. Well, imagine what it could possibly mean. Here is a sentence. I didn't have the heart to break the news to Susan, so my husband did. I didn't have the heart to break the news to Susan, so my husband did. Well, the definition of break the news to someone is in Korean, 누구에게 좋지 않은 나쁜 소식을 전하다. Right? It's difficult sometimes to actually break the news to someone. So it means to tell someone very important news, but usually it's bad news. Here's another sentence. The doctor broke the news to Joe about his sister's cancer as gently as he could. One more time. The doctor broke the news to Joe about his sister's cancer as gently as possible, or as gently as he could. So it's very difficult sometimes to deliver bad news, right? In that case, you can say, I had to break the news to someone, meaning I had to tell him or her about the terrible news. Keep in mind, break the news to someone. That is today's idiom.
What kind of news do you keep up with on a daily basis? What type of news are you mostly interested in? What news outlets or source do you frequent?
I usually read internet news with smartphone. After I got the smartphone, I spend a lot of time to using it and read the newspaper with it. It is easy to contact, and the contents on the screen is very sensational. I think that is the reason why many people using smartphone and read the internet news. With using my phone, I read the entertainment news and I read the political news. And sometimes I read the world topic. However, it takes a lot of time in a day, and I think it is a waste of time. So I try to read the real newspaper and not the internet news with smartphone.
유인영님, 감사합니다. That was a wonderful interview for today's actual interview. Now, quickly, what did she say? She uses her smartphone to check out the news to keep up to date with it. But also, she prefers to read print newspapers too, checking out the news online. Let's see what a great job she did. First of all, she says, using my phone, I read the entertainment news and I read the political news. This is great. But I did put I read in parentheses because this could be omitted, okay? I read. You can just say it once and it'll be perfect. Moving on to another one. However, it takes a lot of time in the day. It takes a lot of time. It's a waste of time, possibly, and I think it is a waste of time. So she's talking about the good things, perhaps, what she does or how she checks out the news, and she also mentioned the downside. She thinks it is a waste of time to keep an eye on your smartphone just to check the news. Two oopsies. I think that is the reason why many people using smartphone, okay, pay attention to the tense, using smartphone and read the internet news. What you can say is, I think that's the reason why people use their smartphone to read the news, okay? They're not using it at the present, but in general, they use it. So you should say not using, but use their smartphones to do something. Another one, she also says, so I try to read the real newspaper and not the internet news with smartphone. By now, what should we call the real newspaper? Print newspaper, that's right. So I try to read print newspapers or the print newspaper and not online or internet news on my smartphone, or you could also say with my smartphone. All right, so by now you all know not to say real newspaper. If you're actually talking about the paper newspaper, call it print newspaper. Okay, that is all for today's actual interview. Job well done. Now you know how to talk about specific sections of the newspaper. And for your information, for those of you that actually have time, you can come to our homepage. I'll be giving you information on that in just a bit. And check out some more info. I've got some information, detailed information on some of the sections or pages you will find in the newspaper. That'll be up with our script on our homepage. So today we talked about the news in general, which news sources you frequent, and which parts of this section you read. So talk about that with your friends, anyone, or perhaps make use of the expressions in your English interview. Next time we'll be talking about the different types of homes, so tune in for that as well. In the meantime, come to our homepage at www.ebse.co.kr. Look forward to Nipo at Actual Speaking and come by just to say hello, I guess. That is all for today. I'll catch you again next time. Bye, everyone.